वेलकम टू Khanversations। मैं आपका होस्ट, आपका दोस्त मुख्तदर खान, और आज मेरे साथ दो बहुत ही प्रोमिनेंट इंडिया के डेवलपमेंटल इकोनॉमिस्ट हैं। डॉक्टर संतोष मेहरोत्रा, जो शो पर आ चुके हैं कई बार, आप लोग सब उनसे वाकिफ हैं। तो वो उन्होंने इंडियन गवर्नमेंट के साथ भी काम किया है, प्लानिंग कमीशन के साथ, यूएन के साथ भी काम किया है, और ही इज नाउ ए प्रोफेसर एट बाथ यूनिवर्सिटी इन यूके। और हमारे साथ हैदराबाद से आमिरुल्लाह खान हैं, जो हु इज ऑल्सो ए डेवलपमेंटल इकोनॉमिस्ट। इंडिया में मेरे ख्याल से सरप्लस हो गए डेवलपमेंटल इकोनॉमिस्ट। तो आज हम इन दोनों से,
इसीलिए हम भाग लिए डॉक्टर खान, हमने इसीलिए भाग लिया।
तो आज हम इस साल 2024 में इंडिया की इकोनॉमी, हाउ डिड इट फेयर, उसका रिव्यू करेंगे। वी विल ट्राई टू गेट अ सेंस ऑफ इट। Overall, there are some positive indicators. इस साल Indian economy has crossed $1 trillion in foreign direct investments. लेकिन मुझे लगता है उसमें दाल में कुछ काला है। 25% of those foreign direct investments are coming from Mauritius. तो मैंने एवरेज करके देखा, $25 बिलियन अगर साल को आ रहा है मॉरिशस से, और मॉरिशस की टोटल जीडीपी $15 बिलियन है, तो इतना पैसा हाउ आर दे जनरेटिंग $10 बिलियन मोर देन देयर एवरेज जीडीपी? तो देयर इज समथिंग गोइंग ऑन देयर, एंड आई थिंक इट इज ब्लैक मनी को व्हाइट मनी करके वो दे आर ट्राइंग टू डू दैट। बट वी विल टॉक अबाउट इट। द बिगेस्ट न्यूज फ्रॉम इंडिया इज के सेकेंड क्वार्टर में इंडिया की जो जीडीपी ग्रोथ रेट है, इट फेल फ्रॉम 7% टू 5.4%। आई थिंक आमिर, आप फ्रीज हो चुके हैं, बट वी विल स्टार्ट। सर जी, आप विल स्टार्ट विद संतोष साहब। संतोष साहब, बताइए मुझे कि व्हाट, हाउ डू यू असेस इंडियाज 2024 फ्रॉम एन इकोनॉमिक पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू?
So the economy is facing a multiplicity of crises which the standard press and the standard national media does not quite capture. And the good news is that the Financial Times and other foreign papers have begun to understand that, and so has the economists, I believe. You see, we've been calling ourselves the fastest growing large economy in the world.
Gee.
And that is true. But the point is, most people don't realize that for the last 20 years, we've been the second fastest growing large economy in the world, in any case, just after China. Now, China has slowed down, so we have become the fastest. This is point one. Point two about this phenomenon is the following: that we had contracted very severely in the wake of COVID-1, and when that happened, you see our economy contracted by twice as much as the global economy in FY21, which is 2021. The global economy contracted by 3.1%, and our economy contracted by 5.8%. This was on account of policy mistakes. The health crisis was managed poorly. The economy, the fiscal and monetary policy stimulus was rather poorly designed. So we shrank. Because we shrank, when we, in the following year, when we came out of it, we obviously were going to rebound. From a low base, you are bound to rebound at a fast rate. And that rebound and recovery was reasonably good, as a result of which we became the fastest growing large economy in the world. Now we are normalizing. You see that if you look at quarter by quarter, in the year of 2024, you will notice that there is a consistent decline from one quarter to another, as you can see in this graphic that you are showing. Rightly so. Every quarter it has consistently declined. So that upswing which you are seeing from the base of 2021 is only on account of the recovery, rebound, and now we are normalizing. And you see, the point is, there is no international agency, OECD, World Bank, IMF, which projects India's growth rate to be higher than 6.5% over the rest of the 2020. So there's nothing very impressive. about the recovery. We have normalized. 6.5 is just not good enough for job creation because a lot of young people have gotten educated, they are looking for work, and unemployment is not coming down. We need to generate 10 to 11 million new non-farm jobs each year. But there is a big narrative that the government is spinning out on that, and we can come back to that.
आमिर, इंटरनेट पर ये जो सुनने वाले हैं उन सबको कह रहा हूँ, ये छोटा सा एक्सरसाइज आप करके देखें. सिंपल इंटरेस्ट के फॉर्मूलाज बहुत आसानी से मिल जाते हैं. कैलकुलेट व्हाट विल बी द प्रिंसिपल आफ्टर. तो मैं उसमें इंडिया का जीडीपी डाला, फिर 23 इयर्स के बाद कैलकुलेट किया एट 7% ग्रोथ. तो इफ इंडिया वे टू ग्रो एट 7% फॉर 23 इयर्स, यानी 1947 तक, तो इंडिया का टोटल जीडीपी विल बेयरली टच $10 ट्रिलियन. 23 साल में 10 ट्रिलियन. और मैंने पॉपुलेशन को भी कम कर दिया, 1.4 बिलियन से 1.2 बिलियन. मतलब आई एम अज्यूमिंग दैट इंडिया पॉपुलेशन विल गो डाउन. तो भी इंडिया का पर कैपिटा इनकम डज नॉट एक्सीड $8,000. And I don't know what the benchmark will be, World Bank, but that doesn't make India a middle income economy. तो ये विकसित भारत का ड्रीम, how is it going to be realized at this growth rate, 6.5%, 6%, 5.5%, अगर if it stabilizes at the current rate?
It's a question that I really want to discuss and answer, and this comes from this very disturbing feeling that India seems to have become a classical middle-income trapped failed country, and I'm saying that with great trepidation and with great responsibility, because what's happened is that incomes, the classical middle income incomes of most Indians, especially those who are, in the middle, remove the top 15% and remove the bottom 50%, that 35% in the middle, those incomes have been stagnating for at least 12 years now. The poor have seen a modest growth in their income, and this is only because of the increased number of subsidies that have been rolled out. A disturbing 100 million or more young people, are those who are neither in the workforce nor are in education. So where are they? 100 million is a lot of people. And paradoxically, the people employed in agriculture, the number of people employed in agriculture, and again, it will startle a lot of viewers and listeners. The number of people employed in India's agriculture is the highest ever right now. Right, the proportion might be a shade less than 50%, but the number of people in agriculture is the highest ever. Half the population still depends on agriculture, while agriculture's share in GDP is the lowest ever. So that's another classical sign of a failed middle income country. The third issue is that all this manufacturing, which is barely 15-16% of the economy, maybe 20%, almost all of it is in the informal sector. The informalization of the economy and the unorganized nature of the economy is like never before. And you see, as a result, what's happening is because of this stagnation of incomes, the average person in states like UP, Bihar, Assam earns less than the average Bangladeshi or the Nepali. And so much for this illegal immigrant stuff. Today, the per capita income in Assam is substantially lower than the per capita income in Bangladesh. So also in UP and so also in Bihar. So that's the worry. So you see, what's happening is that there is a section 10 to 12% of the population that is doing reasonably well. That's the section that everybody sees when one talks of shining India and Viksit India. But that substantial portion in the middle, which is actually the population that makes up consumption demand is stagnating, and that is earning lesser and lesser money. So, and this is the classical problem that we are going to have, because this structural demand constraint that we are seeing is going to make people in larger parts of India poorer and poorer. So, what is it that is happening? Firstly, consumption levels, and this, Professor Santosh Mehrotra has pointed out and calculated and done it so well, that the consumption expenditure growth is even lower than pre-pandemic levels. Now that's a serious issue, right? So it's been 5 years and we are still lower than what we were in 2019, and you can see that. The final point I want to say in this segment, Muqtedar, is that the one issue that we are now hearing very often, and this is interesting because in India you normally don't hear news that is not very good. Not, does not say that news that you hear is about how India is growing and how it's taking over the world and becoming a bigger and better economy. But what you're hearing very often now from a bunch of multinationals and domestic companies is we are unable to sell. Right? And that is two-wheeler sales going down, four-wheeler sales going down, smartphones, right? Except for Apple, which seems to be doing better, but smartphones, the growth rate going down. So coupled with the fact that there are too many people in agriculture, that the middle class is stagnating, that 100 million are neither working nor looking for jobs, that they are not in the workforce, is this aspect that growing India at whatever rate it's growing, 5 or 7%, is unable to afford two-wheelers, smartphones, refrigerators, and cars. This is the headline for 2024.
Sir, संतोष जी, जो आमिर ये जो बता रहे हैं, the decline FMCG, ये ना fast moving consumer goods में जो decline हुआ है in their buying purchasing power, तो मैं थोड़े experts को सुन रहा था कि why the GDP growth rate has dropped in the second quarter to 5.4. तो उनके जो explanations हैं, एक तो ये कि because elections था, the government cannot make pronouncements for major schemes because of the election, so they had to wait. Basically explanation यही है कि जो government infrastructure capital investments होते हैं वो बराबर नहीं हुए हैं, इसलिए the growth is down. But मतलब how long can India continue to grow based on just government investments in infrastructure without मतलब consumer spending या private investments भी नहीं आ रहे हैं? So why this lack of confidence in the Indian economy? हालांकि इतना बोलबाला है, इतना चर्चा है कि कल हम third biggest economy बन जाएंगे, परसों हम fourth, मतलब we will overtake America within a few years. बातें तो इस तरह काफी हो रही हैं, but why is that not triggering more confidence for domestic investments, खासतौर से private sector से?
जी नहीं, बहुत वाजिब आपका सवाल है और उसका मैं सीधा जवाब देने की कोशिश करता हूँगा कि देखिए, ये आपको बहकाया जा रहा है कि इलेक्शन थे, इस वजह से खर्चा ज्यादा नहीं किया गया, पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पे संभव नहीं था। वो बात सही है अपनी जगह, मगर पॉइंट ये है कि मोटा सवाल आपका बिल्कुल वही है, रह जाता है फिर भी कि भाई पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर या इन्वेस्टमेंट नहीं हो रहा तो प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट क्यों? सबसे बड़ा सवाल वही है, और उसका जवाब एक ढंग से आमिर भाई दे चुके हैं अभी, मगर उस पर मैं थोड़ा सा इलैबोरेट करना चाहता हूँ। मैं थोड़ा सा इलैबोरेट करता हूँ। पहली चीज जो आपने FMCG की बात करी, दैट्स अ सबसेट ऑफ द एंटायर मैन्युफैक्चरिंग सेक्टर, एंड आई हैव अ फीलिंग that it's not entirely understood in this country by economic commentators that something very important and deep has happened in the economy in the last 10 years, which is not written about, which is the following. although both were hinted at by us. The first is that the manufacturing contribution to gross value added in the economy, which was 25% for a full, which was 17% for a full 25 years prior to 2015. Okay, it was 17% for a full 25 years after the economic reforms began. That actually fell. It systematically fell from its 17% average rate to first 16, then 15, then 14, then 13. It troughed, it bottomed out at 13, and it has since, in the last year or two, only just risen up to 15.9%. So it's nowhere close to the 17. In other words, despite all the talk about the performance-linked incentives and prior to that, all the talk about Make in India, the manufacturing sector has seen a decline as a proportion of GDA. 1. 2. Manufacturing jobs actually fell in absolute terms for the first time in India's history post-economic reform. And in fact, possibly the first time since independence. It has never happened that total, you see, in 2012, prior to the current government coming to power, the last number we had for detailed numbers we had was for 2012. There were 60 million workers in manufacturing that year. Until 2019, that number was falling. It fell to 55 million. It has only just in the last 2 years or so crossed the 60 million number. That means we've only just recovered the where the level of our manufacturing employment in the last year or so, which prevailed 10 years ago. So on the one hand, manufacturing output on the downside and employment on the downside. At the same time, as Amir rightly said, there has been an increase in employment in agriculture in the last 4 years. This has completely reversed a erstwhile 15-year long process from 2004 to 19, when the absolute number of workers in agriculture was declining because non-farm jobs were growing reasonably well. Workers were being pulled out of agriculture. The lockdown and the poor management of COVID and the poor quality of the fiscal and monetary stimulus post-COVID has meant that the economy did not grow well and did not create jobs. As a result of it, there was an absolute increase in the number of workers in agriculture of, believe it or not, Khan Sahab, 80 million. Even in 23-24, there were 20 million workers added to agriculture. Now, this is a complete reversal of the process of structural change that was going on until about 5-6 years ago, and this reversal was set in motion by demonetization, poorly designed GST, and so on. So, all of this has meant that consumption has shrunk, demand has shrunk, incomes are not growing, joblessness has grown, people are borrowing from the retail bank lending has grown, and household savings as a proportion of GDP have actually shrunk. Under the circumstances, if savings shrink, because household savings are the bigger share of total savings. If savings are shrinking, then why are you expecting demand? People are obviously maintaining consumption on the basis of borrowing. So under the circumstances, if FMCG demand is not growing, manufacturing investment is not taking place, it's because the private investor doesn't have the confidence. He's sitting on money. Don't think he's not sitting on money. His profits have grown dramatically after corporate tax rates were reduced by this government in 2019. And also, their debt has been dramatically reduced because they have used the corporate tax rate reduction to pay back their debts to banks. So, the corporate profits are at an all-time high. So, we've got a shocking situation where they are sitting on money. So, they're taking money abroad. They're not investing at home. That's the crisis of our economy.
आमिर, ये जो मिडिल इनकम ट्रैप है, इसमें लोग कहते हैं कि चाइना इज आल्सो स्टक इन द मिडिल इनकम ट्रैप, दूसरे कंट्रीज भी आर स्टक, एंड सो उनका जो फॉर्मूला है, I think there's an Indian economist there called Gill who came up with this whole argument.
Indamit Gill.
हाँ जी हाँ. So he was making this argument of three I's, यानी जो वर्ल्ड बैंक की क्लासिफिकेशन है, देयर इज लो इनकम, लोअर मिडिल इनकम, अपर मिडिल इनकम एंड देन अपर इनकम इकोनॉमीज. तो इंडिया इज इन हाँ लोअर सेकंड कैटेगरी में है. तो दे सेइंग कि भाई अगर आप लो इनकम से लोअर मिडिल इनकम में जाना है तो यू हैव टू फोकस ऑन इन्वेस्टमेंट्स एंड द नेक्स्ट स्टेप इज इन्फ्यूजन, यानी जो दूसरी इकोनॉमीज में जो इनोवेशन हो रहा है वो आप कॉपी करें और अपनी इकोनॉमी में लेकर आए. बट द थर्ड स्टेप जहां पर आप मिडिल इनकम से अपर इनकम के लिए जाते हैं, सो दे आर टॉकिंग अबाउट इनोवेशन. बगैर आप इनोवेशन के यू आर नॉट गोइंग टू मूव अप. तो टू मी व्हाट वाज सरप्राइजिंग इज दैट के इनोवेशन इज टाइड टू एजुकेशन. तो मैं डेटा देख रहा था, इंडिया इज स्पेंडिंग अराउंड 12 to 14 billion dollars on education, whereas China is spending $900 billion. मतलब the difference in investment in education, 14 billion किधर, 900 billion किधर. So if they are producing workers who are far better educated, far better trained, and therefore they are able to innovate, और वो भी अभी भी they are stuck at 12 to 13,000 dollars per capita income. Why isn't there this awareness in India कि education जो इंडिया की स्ट्रेंथ थी, वी टॉक अबाउट इंडियंस डूइंग वेल एकेडमिकली वर्ल्ड वाइड, मतलब वो हॉलो आउट हो जा रहा ना, द कोर ऑफ द कंट्री in terms of the workforce if there's no investment in education. How do we explain this? मतलब इसका what is the other way around this?
Thanks, Muqtedar. This entire thing about the middle income trap, education, of course, is a very important issue, and I'll come to that in a minute. But you see, it's also about bad healthcare, it's about malnutrition, it's about inequality, all of that. But let's come to education. The education story is not a recent story. The education issue has to be understood in its entirety in India on two counts. One is the abysmal number of people in higher education. See, we always had very poor enrollment in higher education. It didn't matter so much because there were a lot of jobs available to those who didn't go for higher education. Today, almost all employment depends on higher education, and therefore, if you have gross enrollment ratios that are between 20 to 30% for most states, and in UP and Bihar and Assam, where it's less than 15%, then you have a serious deficit as far as higher education is concerned. The second is the access to education, access to quality education. You see, the UNDP does these calculations on access to education, and you realize that in India, education is still a huge privilege. Education or quality education is available to only those who are in that top 15%. So therefore, it is not just a question of poor quality of education, it's also a issue of access to education. And that is the serious issue. That if you see states like Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan or Assam, you will realize that more than 50% of the population has no access to education beyond secondary school. No access. You are only educated if you are privileged. And that is the big concern, and that's the issue that Indermeet and everybody else is talking about in terms of not only poverty being present, but also education as a passport out of poverty, not available to those who are poor.
संतोष साहब, ये जो बात आमिर ने बताई है कि एजुकेशन का एक्सेस, सो फॉर एग्जांपल अगर हम साउथ को देखते हैं, places like Karnataka, Hyderabad, Chennai, you see that their per capita income of some of these cities, even Mumbai, is like 5-6 guna zyada to Bihar. And so these are on the verge of becoming high income economies, like 10-12,000 से ज़्यादा पर कैपिटा इनकम है इन शहरों का, बट इन शहरों में भी इन्फ्लेशन बहुत ज़्यादा हो गया है. Like cities में इन्फ्लेशन इन इंडिया राइट नाउ दे से इज अराउंड 10%. हालांकि ओवरऑल जो अगर आप CMI या इधर डेटा देखें तो 6%, 6.5% कहते हैं. तो सो व्हाट इज हैपनिंग कि इतना जब पैसा है इन्वेस्टमेंट्स के लिए वो नहीं आ रहा है. इन्वेस्टमेंट्स इन एजुकेशन इज मतलब सर्विस इंडस्ट्री अगर आप ग्रोथ करना चाह रहे हैं देन यू नीड टू हैव दिस एजुकेशन रिलेटेड थिंग. सो व्हाई इन स्पाइट ऑफ ऑल ऑफ दिस फिर ये एक जो नया सिस्टम शुरू हुआ है ये लाभ भारती वाला, where you are basically buying votes in a directly. यहाँ पर भी जो बाइडन ने स्टूडेंट लोन्स माफ करने की कोशिश की थी. So where the government literally borrows money and then gives it away directly to transfers it to the population. तो उससे ये जो डिपेंडेंसी बढ़ रही है स्टेट पर, मतलब द डिपेंडेंसी ऑन द स्टेट हैज इंक्रीज सो मच कि जीडीपी ग्रोथ के लिए भी यू नीड स्टेट इन्वेस्टमेंट्स. आपको रोटी पकाना है, खाना खाना है तो भी आप स्टेट पे डिपेंडेंट है. तो ये जो मतलब द सो कॉल्ड मॉडल ऑफ मूविंग अवे फ्रॉम सोशलिज्म, वी सीम टू बी कमिंग बैक टू दैट स्टेट ड्रिवन सेंट्रल ड्रिवन इकोनॉमी. मतलब आपको कैसा लगता है?
नो, इट्स डिप्रेसिंग. आप बिल्कुल वजह फरमा रहे हैं और मुझे बहुत दुख है कि हम इस पड़ाव पे आकर के खड़े हो गए हैं. और इसमें बदलाव लाया जा सकता है अगर नीतिगत रूप से इसके बारे में सरकार चर्चा करने के लिए और अपनी गलतियां मानने के लिए तैयार होती तो मैं आई वांट टू टेक द डिस्कशन बैक टू एजुकेशन फर्स्ट बिफोर आई कम bring it to the issues that you were just raising, and I will bring them back to the issues that you were raising about, the potential for the middle income trap and the excessive welfareism, overt welfareism that we are seeing evidence of. So now on the education, I think we have, आपने एक बड़ा गहरा सवाल पूछा कि ये स्थिति हम पहुंचे कैसे कि हम $12 billion खर्च कर रहे हैं, वो $900 billion खर्च कर रहे हैं चाइना वाले. तो हम पहुंचे इस वजह से हैं डॉक्टर साहब क्योंकि our education system, like our society, is the Brahmanical education system. It is highly segmented education system. Now, you and I are the beneficiaries of the top end of our higher education system, which produces, and literally the top end of the higher education system, and Amir obviously is included, where, we are global citizens and we can capture the labor market in any field, anywhere in the world, which is the reason why you have the phenomenon of 700 firms in Silicon Valley being owned and run by Indians. Now, there the narrative, of course, is that these people have come out of the best institutions of the country, and that's how they are able to be what they are. What is not fully appreciated and understood is that historically from 1950 to 1990 until the economic reforms began, our policymakers neglected school education, which the Chinese did not. So the Chinese invested in health, education, land reform, and they made sure that human capital, a certain level of human capital was achieved, and that's one reason why they were able to, like the other Southeast Asian countries, Korea, Taiwan, etc., attract foreign direct investment because these foreign firms saw that the workers of the right quality were actually available. India was not able to do so precisely for the reason, meaning we didn't attract the FDI. तो हमारे यहाँ जो वो इन्फ्यूजन जिस प्रकार का होना चाहिए था, जो इंटरमिथ स्किल की बात कर रहे हैं अपनी वर्ल्ड डेवलपमेंट रिपोर्ट में हाल की 2024 की, वो हमारे यहाँ नहीं हुआ. अब हाल में बढ़ा है क्योंकि एजुकेशन लेवल्स एक्चुअली बढ़े. उस पर मैं वापस आ सकता हूँ अगर वक्त रहा तो. मगर मोटी बात ये है डॉक्टर साहब, ये आपके श्रोताओं को समझना बहुत जरूरी है, खासतौर से वो श्रोता जो अमेरिका में बैठे हुए हैं या विदेश में बैठे हुए हैं, कि हमने स्कूल एजुकेशन को इतना ज्यादा निग्लेक्ट किया कि जब 1991 में हमारी इकोनॉमिक रिफॉर्म शुरू हुए और हमारी ग्रोथ रेट बढ़नी शुरू हो रही थी, half of our population was illiterate. Half of our population. Our literacy rate was 51%. China was at that year was 71, 75%. तो अब वो जमीन और आसमान का अंतर इस वजह से आया, और वो क्योंकि their approach, the Chinese approach, was a bottom-up approach. Our approach was a top-down approach. We had given preferential treatment to higher education, and the top end of the higher education, which is what we have all benefited from, which only segmented and increased the inequality of an already unequal society deriving from a caste system. Now, under the circumstances, we have only recently caught up in the last 15 to 20 years when our educational levels of our population have improved. However, the big problem, ये जो अब आप लोग डिस्कस कर रहे थे कि हमारा हायर एजुकेशन और खासतौर से उत्तरी राज्यों में कितना हायर एजुकेशन एनरोलमेंट कम है, बात ये है कि in 2006 the average gross enrollment ratio in India for the 18 to 23-year-olds, the relevant age cohort, was only 11%. It shot up within a matter of 10 or 11 years by 2017 to 27%. From 11 to 27 on a rising base, the denominator was rising, which means that you got a massification of school education followed by a massification of tertiary education at a very rapid rate. The private sector expanded, very poor, quality in higher education expanded. So what you got was massification at the cost of quality. So you have, these colleges and universities are churning out unemployable, which is a foundational reason why you have such high levels of unemployment, because even when the economy is growing and jobs are being created, then people are not finding jobs. Now, in this situation, what we need to do, which we should have done in the last 10 or 15 years, but we still need to do now, is the following. We have to divert young people away from entering higher education because they enter higher education because there's no other thing to do, towards vocational education and training. Because too few of our young who are in high school or in higher secondary actually take vocational courses. And too few of our students, even at undergraduate level, are doing science, technology, engineering, and math. Too few are doing STEM subjects. This country needs a lot more STEM subjects because you can't even find enough STEM teachers for your secondary school. So these are the educational problems that we have to address by first diverting students towards vocational education. In China, half of all senior secondary students go into vocational. Only the remaining half remain in general academic subjects. हमारे यहाँ तो उसका उल्टा है. हमारे यहाँ तो जनरल एकेडमिक में बच्चे हायर सेकेंडरी में भी आ जाते हैं, हायर सेकेंडरी में भी आते हैं, यूनिवर्सिटी में भी वही ढर्रा चलता है. तो अब ऐसा अगर ये जनरल, वी नो इट फ्रॉम डेटा, आई हैव एनालाइज्ड दिस इन माय मोस्ट रीसेंट बुक, कि if you have got vocational education or if you have had technical training, the likelihood of your being unemployed is lower. The unemployment rate for general academic students is much higher. But for these technical or vocational trained students, it is there. Even they are finding it difficult because the economy is not generating jobs. And that we can discuss why. But if we were to fix our education system in the way that I'm talking about, there is nothing inevitable of a middle income trap. I mean, I can discuss that, but I don't want to go on, sir. Ji.
Amir, I mean, this is a bit of a googly. You have to unmute yourself. तो सवाल ये है कि there is something going on in the geopolitics, which means कि ये जो reglobalization की बातचीत हो रही है, खासतौर से restructuring supply chains, the effort by the US to make sure कि China does not catch up with the United States. Basically, China की growth in some areas रोकने के लिए, in the green energy, in high-tech areas, and trying to move manufacturing out of China, ये China +1 strategies वगैरह. तो मैं वो गीता गोपीनाथ को सुन रहा था. She gave a talk at Stanford saying कि अगर ग्लोबल इकोनॉमी में फ्रेगमेंटेशन हो जाता है तो उसका नेट रिजल्ट ये होगा कि 7-8% डिक्लाइन हो जाएगी इन द ग्लोबल economy. मतलब GDP of the world will begin to decline rather than go up. तो ये जो चाइना और इंडिया की जो पिछले 1990 से जो ग्रोथ मिरेकल स्टोरीज हैं, दिस इज ऑल डिपेंडेंट ऑन ग्लोबलाइजेशन एज इट वाज, राइट? तो अगर आप ग्लोबलाइजेशन को रिस्ट्रक्चर कर दिए, एंड इफ अमेरिका आल्सो वांट्स टू ब्रिंग बैक जॉब्स टू अमेरिका, जो कह रहे हैं कि वी वांट टू ब्रिंग इट बैक हियर, तो ये जो ग्लोबलाइजेशन का फ्रेगमेंटेशन होगा, I mean, are we going to realize suddenly that India has actually missed the globalization bus, unlike China? कि अगर even Europe is now struggling to think of bringing back manufacturing out of China, इसलिए वो अब टैरिफ भी लगा रहे हैं, protectionism बढ़ रहा है. If Donald Trump has his way, he will break the global economy into fragments. So do you see that as an incoming challenge to India's growth model and its plans to become an alternative manufacturing? Like, how are we preparing for this new scenario?
Let me, put my economist and economics teacher hat on and go back to basic principles. You see, in trade, none of this has ever worked. All this talk about getting jobs back, about deciding where a manufacturing will happen, increasing tariffs, it only results in increased smuggling, as we saw at one time. It results in disrupting domestic economies completely. It results in lowering of economic well-being and output. So none of this, as you rightly said, Europe's been trying, could not do that. The US tried to get the auto sector out of Japan, could never do that. Tried to get manufacturing electronics out of China, could never do that. Textiles out of India. You see, this doesn't happen. It's simple, rational economic behavior at a macro level. You can be rational in a micro sense, but markets behave rationally. And therefore, none of this ever works. Making America great, making India. You see a number of such, failed pompous and bombastic plans. So therefore, we tried it. Look at India, right? For the last 10 years, we've been talking about something called Make in India. And manufacturing sector output has declined.
Yeah.
So much for Make in India, right? It's the same for the US. Nobody wanted to produce in China. Nobody wanted to buy from China. But China prospered because China is more efficient than everybody else. And that's all that matters in trade. So therefore, global geopolitics could cause a rupture here or there. But unless India and Indian output can compete with China on scale, on margins, on profits, and on quality, the India story, export story, will be the way it's growing. With the dollar, touching new heights every day as exports fall. So therefore, yes, in some sense, India did do well in the 90s. You will find a very steep increase in exports as we made the rupee, depreciated the rupee and increased our export volumes. Petroleum, etc., did well. IT exports, all of that. But then, over the last 10, 12 years or so, we've stagnated. And in fact, the exports are not growing anyway, which explains the poor value of the rupee, because we have not been able to improve our quality. And that is the only thing that matters. However much geopolitics would come into play, what will matter in international markets is if you are able to produce better than China does.
संतोष साहब, ये जो लेट मी गिव यू एन एग्जांपल, ये जो चिप मैन्युफैक्चरिंग है, तो उसके दो किस्म के चिप हैं, एक लेगेसी चिप्स कहते हैं और एक जो एआई रिलेटेड स्टफ है. तो आज से 2-3 साल पहले अगर आप स्टैटिस्टिक देखते तो ताइवान वाज द डोमिनेंट प्लेयर इन मैन्युफैक्चरिंग ऑफ लेगेसी चिप्स. अराउंड 80% ऑफ द मार्केट एक ही कंपनी बेसिकली वाज प्रोड्यूसिंग ऑल ऑफ दैट थिंग. लेकिन पिछले 3-4 साल में चाइना हैज डन इज इट हैज स्टेप्ड अप इट्स मैन्युफैक्चरिंग. मतलब इट हैज रीच्ड 50% ऑफ द कैपेसिटी. ग्लोबल मैन्युफैक्चरिंग कैपेसिटी चाइना में 50% है, और वो इतना competition within their own companies create किए. They're working on razor thin margins that it's impossible for the rest of the world to compete with China in manufacturing. या तो वो चाइना को block कर दें and people buy expensive things. मतलब for national interest, I don't know why I would pay $1,000 extra on my laptop. I will, like Amir said, I would look for smuggled goods if there is a possibility of that. But what is interesting to me also is कि ये जो इसका जो करेंसी पे, इंडिया की करेंसी पे देख रहे हैं, इस हफ्ते the dollar has broken the 85, मतलब जो रुपी has broken the 85.4 हो गया है डॉलर. It has the highest, मतलब हर रोज the highest rate चल रहा है, which kind of also dampens this claim that we are reaching $4 trillion. अगर डॉलर की कीमत बढ़ते रहेगी तो we will be chasing the $4 trillion number and not get to that. तो मुझे ये समझ में नहीं आ रहा है कि हाउ इज चाइना एबल टू 2-3 साल में इतना इजीली अपनी इकोनॉमी को वो रिस्ट्रक्चर कर रही टू जियोपॉलिटिकल प्रेशर्स फ्रॉम द यूएस, whereas India is not able to do that. ये बात मुझे समझ में नहीं, like where is the flaw? Is it
मैं आपको
जी
मैं बताता हूँ. देखिए, China is able to restructure because it has historically since early 1990s has a very well designed and well managed industrial policy. In the last 30 years, India has not had an explicit industrial policy. It has some sort of implicit industrial policy, but it has never in the last 30 years, unfortunately, had an industrial policy. China is completely the opposite. You won't believe this. After the economic reforms in China, the State Planning Commission was renamed and became the NDRC, the National Development and Reforms Commission, and it became the hub, the key decision maker in respect of industrial policy. And the industrial policy is driven centrally from the NDRC in China, and that has they not only had a industrial policy for the last 20-30 years, but they currently have a industrial policy 2025, which is focused very much on high-end electronics, nanotechnology, solar, and EVs. So you're absolutely spot on. Our problem is we not only abandoned planning, we have done away with 10 years ago with the planning institution, but we don't have an industrial policy. That's why they're able to make changes, because they run like a coherent, planned economy, and we cannot, because all the decision making is done by so-called policymakers sitting in the Ministry of Finance and the Prime Minister's office in our country. I'll come to the rupee value, but that has to be explained in terms of what you were talking about, globalization, what has happened to globalization. Now, you see, the reason why I don't fully buy into the middle income trap logic and that India may not be able to expand its exports is the following. Yes, it is true that Europe and North America is going moving in the direction of protectionism, and they are nearshoring, friendshoring, and all of that. A lot of employment and investment that has moved out of China has come to Mexico, it has gone to Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries. It has not very much come to India. Now, the point is, India's goal needs to be that it rapidly concludes a free trade agreement with Europe. Because while, there might be lot of talk about protectionism, if India had a FTA with Europe and also worked out a proper FTA like it has with Australia, it has an FTA with UK, then we can still increase our exports to Europe. But it's not just that. We can certainly increase our exports of automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and many other products to Latin America, to Africa, and other Asian countries. But even more important than that, because exports as a proportion of GDP today still is only in the region of 22%. The rest of the demand will have to come from domestic market. And if we were to have a policy which enables labor-intensive manufacturing within the country, it will, and if we invested in agriculture and therefore generated rural demand in the way that rural demand existed, and real wages were rising because non-farm jobs were growing between 2004 and 14, if that strategy was put back in place, as opposed to this neoliberal crony capitalist strategy that has been adopted in the last 8 years or so, with plenty of policy mistakes like demonetization and badly designed GST thrown in. If we were to go back to that kind of strategy, 2004 to 14, jobs will grow, demand will revive. Domestically, we have a vast unmet need for simple manufactured commodities which are labor intensive, and labor intensive manufacturers are the ones which have taken a hit in the last 8 years. If we supported the 5 labor intensive sectors in which demand was growing and output was growing from 4 to 14, were leather footwear, textiles, garments, food processing, and wooden furniture. As people moved out of agriculture, as I was saying earlier, into non-farm jobs, into construction and so on, their incomes rose, so consumption was rising. And what do ordinary people, poor people from rural areas consume in the first flush? These simple kind of manufacturers, more shoes, more clothes, better quality food, they get a little bit of furniture, stuff like that. So what I'm saying is, a domestic demand-oriented manufacturing strategy alongside exports, exploring new markets and also ensuring free trade agreements are signed. Simultaneously, and this brings me back to the rupee point you were making, the rupee value, very important. You see, RBI has managed our rupee rather poorly. Very unfortunately. Somehow there seems to be a fetish. If you watch any national media and BJP spokesperson, they will tell you, oh, look at the size of our foreign exchange reserve. The foreign exchange reserves growing in a developing country which needs to generate much more growth in the country also means that you're not importing enough. You're not importing enough because there's not demand for investment goods here, which means that you have to make sure that your rupee, actually, Khan Sahab, the rupee appears as though it is depreciating, but in real terms, because our inflation rate, you mentioned inflation rate, because our inflation rate is higher than the inflation rate of our competitors, it should be depreciating more. Please try and appreciate this. I'm not talking from a nationalistic perspective. Why were exports growing very rapidly, 15 to 18% per annum for a 25-year period until 2014? Because the real effective exchange rate was stable. If you look at the index of real effective exchange rate, which takes into account our inflation rate vis-a-vis other countries' inflation rate, it was stable. In the last 8-10 years, Khan Sahab, what we've seen is the real effective exchange rate has appreciated, meaning our rupee has strengthened because our inflation rate is very high. Now, that's what has prevented our exports, has also prevented our exports to not grow as much, of course, quite apart from the protectionist approach that has come in, the globalization that has happened. So we have to do everything right on our side in order to be able to increase our exports, while at the same time being aware that most of our market needs to be built up here and we need to produce much more here. So therefore, the incentives have to be for the MSMEs, which produce for the domestic market, sir, not just the corporates, which tend to produce, for people like you and I, if we are living in India, or for export. Back to you, sir.
But sir, talking about the reserves, the reason why India is still a net importer, right? It's a net importer.
Exactly.
More than it exports.
I agree. But why are the reserves rising? The reserves are rising for two reasons. One, that foreign portfolio investment is coming in. You began the show by talking about,
Mauritius.
Mauritius, money coming in. All that is round tripping. You are absolutely right. Money in dollars of foreign currency is being held by exporters and other companies abroad. And when they want to invest, they sort of route it through Mauritius or Singapore, and that's called round tripping, and that's not very surprising. It used to happen a lot in China through Hong Kong,
Okay.
and that's what you are seeing in the case of Mauritius here. So, point is that is of course happening, but the more important point here is that we need to ensure that our our exports grow faster than they have grown, especially of goods. Our services exports are doing very well, sir.
Hmm.
Please don't misunderstand. That's why our foreign exchange reserves are also doing okay. So one is portfolio investment coming in. The other is that our services exports are doing okay. And third, of course, is that, FDI is also coming in. Gross FDI is coming in. Although net FDI is actually not as robust as you might imagine. So these are the combination of these three facts which is raising the foreign exchange reserve.
Also remittances.
Remittance, they've done very well. You are absolutely right, Amit.
$129 billion is
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely right. All these four factors.
So, Amir, this is my last question. कि भाई going forward, I mean, there's a lot of पिछले 2-3 हफ्ते से ये GST को लेकर there's a lot of criticism of निर्मला सीतारामन coming out कि भाई पॉपकॉर्न का देखें वो 12%, नमकीन हो या मीठा हो 18%. But the reason why that the popcorn example is being talked about so much is it shows that there is a class effect taking place, right? So they are saying that there are rich people, Indians, and poor Indians, and so all the good things are for rich Indians, and the poor Indians, मतलब वो नमकीन खाएं, so there's a difference of that. So ये जो division or inequality बढ़ रही है, should we get used to two Indias, one India which is high income and one India which is low income? Or is it in the national interest to try and prevent that inequality, which would mean higher taxation to the rich and more Labharti programs for the poor? So at the moment, what do you think is the national priority? Is it just to keep growing at a rapid pace, even if it means rising inequalities, or some distributive justice needs to be done?
Very simply, Muqtedar, that if you sit back and say that these wealth creators are doing a fabulous job, and that, so what if there is inequality? And serious policymakers have made that comment, saying, do you want us to make the rich poor? This has come from the absolute top, such irresponsible statements. You see, you cannot grow if everybody doesn't grow. That there is absolute, this is not a truism, it's just a very simple matter of fact. However much the top 5% grows, if the bottom 50% does not grow, you are stuck at that $2,700 or $3,000 per capita, and therefore a very low middle income country. The second point is that, you cannot continue to compensate the poor for not providing universal infrastructure, access to health and education. How long can you give free rice and give 2,000 rupees of pension and say that, okay, we will deny you transportation and we'll deny you telecom and we'll deny you education? And the third issue is that one has to understand that investment that is required in India will come in when there is a seriousness that investors see. Why are Indian investors not investing in India? Forget about foreign investors. Maybe it is because the US doesn't have money. Maybe it is because Europe is going down, all the extraneous. And the reason for that is that you you have a government that came in with a wafer thin minority majority, if you can call it one, at 240, it doesn't give great confidence to the capitalist, and particularly the crony capitalist, that here is a strong government that will protect me. Secondly, you give also is concerned, you take a month to get a finance minister. So if you give that kind of signal, and if the whole purpose of policy making is to protect a few big players, is to give more and more compensatory grants for people to not protest, you are not sending a signal. And because you're forever cash strapped, there is nothing that a government can do in terms of spending serious money, as you pointed out right in the beginning. We need serious money in education.
Santosh,
Not a paltry, 3% or 2.5% of GDP for everything in education. So if you cannot do that, that calling out for most attempts. Yeah, go ahead.
Santoshi, like Amir was pointing out, so basically, I mean, are we concluding that India lacks planning and it's constantly crisis managing the economy? Like, even though there is so much talk of it being the fastest growing economy, is doing well, and exports are actually rising. India exports are now close to getting close to $1 trillion, I think, by this year. So while there are increase in exports, it is still less than 25% of the GDP. But are there too many crises which the government is managing instead of planning for a steady growth in all sectors?
The short answer, unfortunately, is yes. Too many crises simultaneously. In fact, my next book, it's called India Out of Work, and it's about the polycrisis that India faces. And the polycrisis consists of three crises simultaneously. One is the structural economic crisis, which I think both of us have hinted at, and you have put your nub on it, the inequality, the growing inequality. And we have to note that this inequality was not increasing up till 1980. It has actually increased since 1980. And in the last 10 years, it has actually crossed all limits, both wealth and income inequality, on top of a social stratification which our society had inherited. And please appreciate, it is now none other than someone like Thomas Piketty is arguing based on very solid data that India's income inequality and wealth inequality is comparable to that found in the most unequal countries of the world, which is South Africa and Brazil. This is not sustainable, and Amir was absolutely right. If we want to grow on a sustained basis, then the market size has to grow, which means demand has to grow, and that is not happening. And it's only when that happens that private investment will pick up, and therefore growth will pick up. So there is just no, that's the first crisis. The second crisis is on account of the structural economic crisis, is that our jobs are not growing. And this has gone to the point where youth unemployment rates, because young are joining at the rate of 10 to 11 million. No, we need to generate 10 or 11 million new non-farm jobs each year, because young are joining. There are those who are already young but who have fallen out of the labor force. They are not in education, employment, or training. There are those who are in agriculture. We've got to pull out. There are all the young women who've gotten educated. We've got to employ them. So all these people have to be employed. So we need to generate nothing short of 10 to 11 million jobs per non-farm jobs per annum. And only half of that number is being created. That's an employment crisis of huge proportions. And for that, our strategy of growth has to change. And finally, the third crisis is that of the education system. Uh, one part of the crisis I already talked about. We massified without learning, and we are not giving the kind of attention to vocational education and training and skilling that we should have and could have, and we are not doing that. So all three crises have to be dealt with simultaneously. Then and only then, and that's my closing remark, can we actually ensure sustained growth of 8 plus percent. And if we did that, we will perhaps for a 23-24 year period, which is the subject you began this show with, if we grew at 8%, we will not only generate the jobs, but we will be able to just about touch the threshold of becoming a high income country. But all these conditions have to be met. So,
Santosh Saab, Amir, thank you very much for this very thoughtful and interesting, and also both optimistic, and also it's a mixed review of India's 20-24 years. There's clearly a lot of promise, but there is also need for more. I think less politics and more planning is perhaps the recommendation, and I'm not very sure whether the course correction can take place given the intensity of politics in the country. Anyway, we will talk again. So thank you to both of you for joining. और आप दोनों का शुक्रिया, और जो Khanversations देख रहे हैं, please thank you very much for watching, और इस चैनल को सब्सक्राइब करें, वीडियो को लाइक करें, और दूसरों के साथ जरूर शेयर करें. Thank you very much.